Well, good afternoon and welcome to the educational system as we know it today. This is History 122. And I'm going to be speaking with this mouthpiece here today. We're going to be taking a look at protests against the establishment. And so we're going to zoom in great big world, we're going to zoom in upon the US of A, and we're going to be taking a look at some of the problems of the United States in the Gilded Age. This will be as we take a look at the lines of transportation linking this country together. We're going to do our notes probably as quickly as we can and try to zoom right through this so you've got the important items. Today, as always, our star will be the vis-a-vis pen. And so let's get to work. Ladies and gentlemen, we're at Roman numeral number 6. And I will illustrate this at times. We're taking a look at protests against the establishment. So get your pens ready, get your pencils going. Protests against the establishment. So previously we've seen protests against America's stratified society. Here we're going to look at those other protests, and we're going to understand something about socialism in the US of A. And so they would say that the problems of American society would be socialism. And so with socialism, it simply means that the government owns the means of production. So the government owns the factories, government owns the land, the railways, and so really the government would pay the people. How well did this work out in communist Russia under Marxist socialism, which is communism? Well, in Russia, the people pretended to work and the government pretended to pay them. There was no reason to really get ahead. Some say the problem with socialism is that it is shared mediocrity. And so why should you try to earn more than somebody else? Because mediocrity. Mediocrity. Okay. But the biggest socialist party in the United States was roughly at the turn of the century, 1900. And when you take a look at the United States, when you take a look at history, socialism needs members of a strong working class. And so those who work in the factories especially are going to want to join the Socialist Party. But the middle class does not really want to share its goodies. And the genius of the United States would be a large middle class. Which would you rather be? Working class or middle class? Probably you want to fit somewhere in the middle class. But we're going to see that in Minnesota, the Socialist Party was fairly strong in northern Minnesota, so that they elected mayors about the year 1910 in Crookston, in Bemidji, in Two Harbors, in Minneapolis. They elected socialist mayors. In North Dakota, we would see in Rugby and in Minot, about the year 1910, also Hillsborough, they elected socialist mayors. But let's take a look at the number one socialist in the United States. His name was Eugene V. Debs. And for Eugene Debs, he ran for the presidency on the Socialist Party ticket 5 times. And in the year 1920, he was in prison for opposition to World War I. So in the 1920 election, this is what the campaign pin looked like. For president, vote for Eugene Debs, convict number 9653. And he was released sometime after the war was over in the early 1920s. But in Bemidji, Minnesota, they loved Eugene Debs because there were so many lumberjacks and so many Scandinavian immigrants who like socialism. And so we would see in the year 1915 that 1,200 gathered in Bemidji to hear Eugene Debs speak to the people. And with Eugene Debs in 1912, he actually carried Beltrami County. And so you look at the vote totals, Eugene Debs carried Beltrami County in the 1912 presidential election with 725 votes to Theodore Roosevelt with 680, Woodrow Wilson 671, and William Howard Taft, who was president at the time, got 433 votes. But if we take a look at Eugene Debs, bear in mind he was the head of the moderate socialists. And with moderate socialists, what they said is that if you educate the people, then they will vote for the Socialist Party ticket because it would be to their advantage if they were in the working class. So we see the illustration of Eugene Debs in the cartoon. Here he is striding through the US of A, distributing his literature amongst the factories and the farms. So it's a cartoon of the Socialist Party about the turn of the century, 1900 or 1910. And so he said, if you educate the people, they will turn to socialism. However, there also would be, number two, the militant socialists. Militant socialists. And these were led by Dan DeLeon. And with Dan DeLeon, he wrote pamphlets on how to overthrow governments. And he said all it would take is a few people in the right place, in the right time, and you could overthrow a government. But he said you had to shoot the rich people in order to bring about a revolution. Well, with Dan DeLeon, there would be, he wrote the pamphlets, and it depends upon who's going to read the pamphlet. And we would see in Russia, Vladimir Lenin read the pamphlets of Dan DeLeon, and then he carried it out in the Bolshevik Revolution during the time period of World War I. And with Dan DeLeon, please don't confuse Dan DeLeon with dandelion, which would be a common backyard weed. Okay, that's the socialists, the militant socialists. These are the Marxists, and they called for communism. There also would be the anarchists. And with the anarchists, they believed that any government was repressive and would take away the rights of the people and would tend to get too big. So their solution would be no government at all. And so they said, do away with the government. Ladies and gentlemen, these are the crazy people. This is the lunatic fringe. These are screwballs. And when we take a look at the anarchists, they would be the international terrorists of that time period. In the 1800s, and for a long time, all the way to 1920, we would see fear of anarchists. In fact, in the United States, we would see that you had to say you were not an anarchist in order to become an immigrant into the United States. Now, don't confuse anarchists with Ted Nugent's old song. It was called Anarchy Burgers in his album Intensity in 10 Cities. But let's take a look at the number one anarchist in the United States. Her name was Red Emma. And with Emma, this was Red Emma Goldman. And with Emma Goldman, she wrote a book called Rebel in Paradise. And don't confuse Rebel in Paradise, her book, with the great tune Stranger in Paradise. Take my hand, I'm a stranger in paradise. That's not what we're talking about. But we take a look at Red Emma. She stood 5'2", She weighed 110 pounds, so she was a small woman. But she had big problems in this country because she was an immigrant to the United States. She was Russian. She happened to be Jewish. She was a communist and an anarchist. But other than being a communist and anarchist, she was actually pretty nice. But she helped found the union called the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. Industrial Workers of the World. And when we take a look at Red Emma and the Industrial Workers of the World, they said you should have one big union. And so if you could get the unskilled laborers, the lumberjacks, the farm workers, people who did not have great job skills, combined with skilled workers, you could make one great big fist of all the poorer people in the United States. And with Red Emma, you can see she was the high priestess of anarchy, as they say it in those days. And she had married a fellow named Alexander Berkman. And with Alexander Berkman was one who got in major trouble because he attacked the president of U.S. Steel, Mr. Frick. This was in 1892, after the Homestead Steel Strike, which I want you to read about in your book. But Alexander Berkman came to the office of President Frick. He drew a pistol and fired 2 times, both bullets hitting Mr. Frick in the neck. And then a fellow who was helping Frick knocked his arm, and a 3rd shot went up into the ceiling. Berkman then drew out a knife and stabbed Frick twice in the back and once in the leg. By that time, help came, a carpenter came, and knocked him out by bopping him right upon the head. Well, with Alexander Berkman, he was tried for attempted murder because the president of U.S. Steel did not die. So if he didn't die, you can't charge him actually with murder. And with Alexander Berkman, he was the editor of a magazine called The Blast. And with The Blast, they were not talking about just having a good time. The Blast was saying that they were to blow up the rich people of the United States. And we would see in the year, here's Alexander Berkman and Red Emma, and we would see in the year 1914, there was a bomb intended in New York City to blow up John D. Rockefeller, but instead it killed the fellow who was making it. And so we're going to see with Red Emma, she was with the Industrial Workers of the World and opposed the United States' entry into World War I. So Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were both deported from the United States. Well, she went to North America. She married a British fellow, got British citizenship. She went to Canada, and the United States would not let her cross the border. Finally, she died in 1940. And when she died in 1940, it was finally okay to let her back in. We let her corpse back in that time period. And so you can see the attitude in the United States towards the anarchists is, let's boot them out of the United States, give them a great big kick. These alien communists was the solution by Uncle Sam in that time period. And as we take a look at these anarchists in the United States and the anarchists in the world, it's fascinating to see that by 1900, these anarchists, the international terrorists of the time, had murdered the Empress Elizabeth of Austria. They had killed the Tsar, Alexander II of Russia. They killed the President of France by the year 1900. They killed the Premier of Spain. They also killed King Humbert I of Italy in the year 1900. They were plotting to kill every head of every Western nation in that time period. In 1900, they attempted to kill the Prince of Wales. They attempted to kill the Shah of Persia. And ladies and gentlemen, in the year 1901, an anarchist killed President William McKinley of the United States. And this fellow's name was Leon Czolgosz. I didn't know how to pronounce it until I had a student who was from Eastern Europe, and he said it simply is Leon Czolgosz. Well, for Leon Czolgosz, he worked in a factory, and probably in the 1890s economic depression, he suffered from what they called a nervous breakdown. But he went to hear Emma Goldman speak in Cleveland, Ohio. And what he said after he had killed the President of the United States, he said about hearing Emma Goldman speak, "She set me on fire. The doctrine that all leaders must be exterminated was what set me to thinking so that my head nearly split with pain. Miss Goldman's words went right through me, and when I left the lecture room, I made up my mind that I have to do something heroic for the cause that I loved." When he was arrested, he gave his name as Fred Nobody. And so he said, a nobody just killed the President of the United States. And so he killed the President. By October of 1901, he was executed very, very, very quickly. And with Leon Czolgosz, that's anarchy in the United States. But also, we take a look at VII, Roman numeral number 7. We're going to take a look at analyses of society. We may only have time for one, but let's take a look. And so, our number one analyst of American society in that time period will be a fellow named Thorstein Veblen. And with Thorstein Veblen, please put a star beside his name. You will see it directly on test number 1. Thorstein Veblen, coming out of Minnesota, may have been the greatest intellectual in American history. In the year 1899, he wrote his book called The Theory of the Leisure Class. You can say, I don't even understand what the theory of the leisure class would be all about. Well, I think that actually you do understand what the leisure class is. They have it made so they do nothing for a living. And we're going to see that from the genius of Thorstein Veblen would come the doctrine of conspicuous consumption. And please put a star beside conspicuous consumption, because I will ask you point blank, what does conspicuous consumption mean? Well, when I take a look around the classroom and I see people who are wearing their really nice tennis shoes, if they're wearing like the Nikes or the Adidas or other really nice shoes, or maybe Crocs. When I see people who are wearing various sweatshirts, it says you're going to see, let's say, the Dallas Cowboys or Minnesota Vikings or Minnesota Twins. We're loyal to all of them, but really you are walking billboards for a company. And I don't know how to tell you this, but back in my time period when I was growing up, people actually wore their labels inside their clothes, on the inside of their clothes. There's something called UA. It's Under Armour, which is showing, I'm pretty sure. But he said that with conspicuous consumption, he said the American system of values was wrong. He said that you show off your wealth by buying items that you don't need. Show off your wealth, or the rich show off their wealth by buying extravagant, in other words, they're way fancier than you really need, items. And we know that this is true. If we go to Minnesota Lakes Country, we will see people who build great big lake houses. When you go to South Moorhead and South Fargo, you will see magnificent large houses. Well, oftentimes in these great big new houses, there will be just 2 people living. They've got 4-car garages. They maybe even have 5-car garages. And there was a fellow by Pelican Lake who built himself a great big lake home, and people asked him, "Why are you building it so big?" And he said, "Because I can." So please put a star beside the definition of conspicuous consumption. And so he said, the leisure class was, you had it made if you could just have the corner office and live off your investments and do nothing for a living except collect your stock market checks. He said the tycoons, the big business tycoons, were simply leeches on society. And in that time period, we would see that the industrial giants were celebrities. They were the big heroes. We take a look at Andrew Carnegie, who would give money for the libraries. He was supposed to be in the news all the time. J.P. Morgan, the international banker, he would be in the news. John D. Rockefeller, people like to read about what they were doing. And I'd like to say that it's different, but it really isn't. We take a look at such individuals as Bill Gates. We take a look at Paul Allen. And with Paul Allen, he's the one who owns the Seattle Seahawks and the Portland Trail Blazers. We take a look at Mark Cuban. And in the years previous to 2016, I was saying that people like to read about what Donald Trump was doing. These are celebrities. But according to Thorstein Veblen, they are bums. They are leeches. They are robber barons. And he said, and it's going to be the deepest thing that you're going to find here today, he said, the meaning of life, well, this is a big day. We're going to find the meaning of life lies not in wealth. The meaning of life lies not in wealth, but in relationships. And so when your parents call to say, "Oh, what did you learn in college today?" Say, "Well, I learned the meaning of life lies not in wealth, but in relationships." And they will say, "Whoever that professor is, you need to give that fellow a raise." And when we take a look at Thorstein Veblen, we can see this handsome young fellow born near Faribault, Minnesota. He then went to Carleton College, and with Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota, that's one of the best, the finest institutions in the state of Minnesota. And he was so smart that he became valedictorian. He was number 1 in his class. And he married the Carleton president's daughter. But he was fired later after he got his bigger degrees, higher degrees, fired from every job in university. He was a rebel. He would do things like not give grades. So this rebel was told by the dean, you have to give grades. And so he gave 1/2 A's, he gave 1/2 C's. The dean was not happy. Also, he got close to his students, too close. The college president didn't think it was a good idea, neither did his wife, and eventually she divorced him. And when we take a look at Thorstein Veblen, we would see, as he got the longer hair later on, he died an angry, cynical man. He said, never put up a statue dedicated to him. He wanted all of his writings destroyed. And with Thorstein Veblen, he died in a shack out in California. But we can see in the state of Minnesota that his family homestead is now a National Historic Landmark there near Faribault. And now it is an Airbnb. And I think you can stay there for about $100 a night down there in southern Minnesota, south of the Twin Cities. That's Thorstein Veblen. But also, we're going to take a look at, oh, we are moving fast, VIII, the Roman numeral number 8, the social gospel movement. And ladies and gentlemen, please put a star beside the social gospel movement. And this term is going to make some sense. It's an attempt to inject Christianity into daily living in the industrial age. So social gospel, inject Christianity into daily living to try to improve city life in the industrial age. That's the social gospel movement. Now, I think you understand some of this because you're going to see something like liberation theology, where churches should be involved in ridding the world of oppression. But the problem is it can be too social and not have enough gospel in it, where you don't do the conversion and the preaching. And so we take a look at the social gospel, that the church should meet the social needs of the members in the congregation. And so we're going to see letter A, a famous author's name was Charles Sheldon. And Charles Sheldon wrote a book called In His Steps. And in the book, In His Steps, written in 1897, we would see that it became an inspirational classic. It was the biggest seller in the United States for 50 years, translated into 37 languages, about 15 million copies sold of In His Steps. But about any decision that you make in the industrial age, especially as you're going through the city streets, you should ask yourself, what would Christ decide in this situation? And in every test, check and see what you think that Christ would do. So here you can see the book title, In His Steps, the inspirational classic. Oh, over 10 million copies sold. So, but he exaggerated at 15 million. But In His Steps. But you know it by a revival 100 years later in 1997. Because with the book, In His Steps, the subtitle was WWJD. So WWJD, what would Jesus do in this situation? And so when you see somebody asking for money on the street corner, what should you do? Well, my wife informed me that you should simply take the person to a nearby restaurant and then buy a meal for the person rather than giving just money, because you don't exactly know what the person's going to do with that money. But also, we take a look at letter B within the social gospel movement. We take a look at the Reverend Walter Rauschenbusch. And with Walter Rauschenbusch, I know that that's a mouthful, Rauschenbusch, but here we would see a fellow who went from being a Lutheran to being a Baptist. You can say, I'm surprised that he went from being Lutheran to Baptist necessarily. But he said, the industrial leaders should be Christians within society. They should be less swinish towards consumers. Take better care of the consumers. He said the public behavior of the tycoons should match the private behavior of these business tycoons. And he asked the question, how many Christs are there in the time period? How many Christs are there? Is there one for the rich? Is there another for the poor? Is there another for the middle class? Should there be one Christ for all people? He said, yes. There should be one Christ for all people for all time. He said, all people are equal at the foot of the cross. They asked, are you your brother's keeper? And he said, yes, I am my brother's keeper. So I should take better care of people. So we see in Christianity Today the story of Walter Rauschenbusch, the champion of the social gospel. Born in 1861, died in 1918. And we also will understand the social gospel movement the best by the story of the Salvation Army. And you can say, yeah, I think I know the Salvation Army. Well, it was established by the fellow from England. His name was William Booth. And with William Booth, what he did, he had applied Christianity in the industrial era in Great Britain. He said you should provide clothes, that you should provide food, you should provide dollars and shelter for the poor. And with William Booth, the Chicago bishop said, I don't like the Salvation Army, but God does. And so, ladies and gentlemen, you know the Salvation Army because they have the bell ringers. They also have the thrift shops where you can buy very stylish clothing donated to the Salvation Army stores for a very, very, very good price. And some people find really good fashions at the Salvation Army. But think of soup kitchens, especially, in order to help people. That's practical Christianity. And so we see William Booth, the man of the long beard. I admire him for his beard. I seem to hear a voice sounding in my ears. Where can you go and find such heathen as these? And where is there so great a need for your labor as within the cities? Born 1829, died in 1912. The date's not important for our purpose. But next, we take a look at letter D. And this will be the settlement house movement. And with the settlement house movement, we would see in Chicago, the key example was a place called Hull House. And so with Hull House, please put a star beside it. But this would be the story of Jane Addams. And with Jane Addams, she set up the settlement houses in order to help immigrants to this country, immigrants in Chicago. And so there at Hull House, the immigrants would learn English, they would learn job skills, such as how to be a carpenter, but also they would teach little kids whose parents were working. So it was an early form of daycare as well. And eventually it took up a whole city block, a whole block in Chicago with 13 buildings. But it started out relatively small. And the story goes that Jane Addams had been walking down a street in the city, and she heard a 3-year-old child screaming. So a 3-year-old in an upstairs, out of an upstairs window, screaming. She went in to investigate. She found that the child was bound to a bed with food and a bedpan provided for the child, but both parents worked. They could not afford a babysitter, and so she said, I must help the people in industrialized Chicago. And so we would see the story of Benny Goodman. And with Benny Goodman, he was one of the greatest jazz clarinetists ever. And with Benny Goodman, He was one of 8 children in a Jewish tailor's family. And the parents could not afford any lessons for Benny Goodman, but he learned to play the clarinet in the Hull House Band. And with the Settlement House movement, it was copied. It was a pattern. It was copied in other cities. So settlement houses to help the people, copied in other cities. We see Jane Addams of Hull House from that time period. And here she's busy reading a book about how to help the poor people. And here we can see the Hull House in Chicago, marked as a historic site in Chicago in that time period. And with Hull House, please don't confuse Hull House in Chicago with a very poor movie, a scary movie of the 1960s, which I never saw, called H-E-double-L House. That would have been scary. And with Jane Addams, don't think of the Addams family. It's not that kind of Addams. But we also will take a look at the Catholic view of the social gospel. Now, it was mainly Protestant, but we're going to also see Pope Leo the 13th, III. In the year 1891, he issued the papal encyclical. And a papal encyclical simply means a papal announcement, a papal authoritative announcement. He issued Rerum Novarum, and you think of chanting Rerum Novarum, it was of new things. And so he was telling about the new things of the industrial age. He was referred to as the working man's pope because he spoke and said that factory owners needed to provide better treatment of the workers, better treatment of factory workers, to provide better wages, better hours as well for the working people. And with a papal bull, as they say a papal encyclical could be, well, a papal bull, don't think it's as one student said on a paper. It's not this way, where the papal bull is not really a bull, but a cow that was kept in the Pope's palace to provide milk for the Pope's children because, frankly, the Pope doesn't have any children. But when we take a look at the social gospel movement, it provides a Christian reason for changes in American society. But also, we would take a look at the big question in that time period. And this would be the big question: is humankind basically bad, or is humankind bad? Bad. Or basically good. Well, if we take a look at the issue, we would see that, according to John Locke, humankind was basically good. So we see the Enlightenment. In the Enlightenment, humankind is basically good. You can be making progress. But if you take a look at Thomas Hobbes would say that humankind is basically bad or evil. And when you take a look at this, if you are a classroom teacher, do you believe that humankind is basically good or basically bad? Well, as a longtime teacher, teaching since 1979, I believe that human nature is basically bad, because people try to get away with whatever they can get away with, such as sneaking a look at their cell phones when they're supposed to be putting the bloomin' things away. But there would arise in this time period pragmatism. And with pragmatism, they say, well, humankind is really neither basically bad nor basically good. They would say, you simply do what works best. And how well is that working out in modern times, in the postmodern era? Whatever works. And so you can say, this works for me, maybe it does not work for you. Okay, so as far as illustrations, we take a look at Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII on capital and labor. Pope Leo XIII, the great encyclical letters. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think that we have gone as far as we wish to go in taking a look. It's been about, I think it's been about 50 minutes. It's been about 1 hour. And so we have scanned the history of the United States. And your instructor has done the best that he could in this time frame. And so your instructor bids you a farewell here today and says, take the good notes, be sure you put a star beside those items that are starred, and have a great day. As I, whoops, that's probably the wrong music. Thanks. See you the next time when I get back.